Well, good afternoon from Pittsburgh, from the campus of Carnegie Mellon University on a beautiful sunny day, although it's a little bit chilly for us here. But I'm John Sangenberger, and I'm Executive Director of Alumni Relations at the Tepper School, and we're very delighted this afternoon to invite you to join us and come back into the classroom for our webinar series. And today we're talking about AI once again, the fourth in our series of webinars on AI, generative AI, and how it's impacting business and society. We've got a great presentation today. But before I get started to talk about that, I'm going to give you a couple of my announcements of what's going on. We wanted to tell you about our upcoming Tepper webinars. We've got 3 coming up in the spring. So after we're taking December off, but we'll see you in January. We're almost ready to confirm all the speakers for our annual Tepper Investment Outlook Alumni Panel. So we'll have that set for you. And then in February, we're going to continue our AI and organizational behavior and marketing, though. Here's some of our other faculty members. You'll get 2 for the price of 1 webinar with Sungkung Lee and Joy Liu. So we're excited about that. And then in March, right before you get ready to file all your taxes and everything, we'll talk about AI in finance and in operations. So some great faculty who are going to be presenting to us then, and we'll have more information for you as we go into 2024. Also want to make sure you know about the Tepper upcoming Tepper reunion. It's going to be April 19th and 20th, 2024. It's the 75th anniversary of the founding of GSIA, or the Tepper School of Business. And we're very excited about that. So if you're 4 or 9 or one of our one-year grads, we're looking forward to having you back on campus. If you're one of our undergrads, you're going to come the weekend before, April 11th to 14th, for Carnival 2024 and reunion weekend. So we're looking forward to having our undergrads back on campus for that special celebration. It's also time for us to be making our final nominations for our Tepper 2024 Alumni Awards. So think about alumni that you may have in your class or you may connected with that are outstanding in their service or their achievement, whether they're recent alumni or senior level alumni. We'd love to have those award nominations. If you can get them in as soon as possible, we'll be able to present those to our alumni board, who will make those decisions, and we'll be celebrating that at reunion weekend in April. We also want you to know that November 28th is coming up. It's going to be CMU Giving Day, annual Giving Day around the world, but our theme this year is Level Up, giving a level up, and we're asking you all to participate. If you haven't made your annual gift to the Tepper School of Business yet, this is the time to start making it. Your gifts can actually come in now. So if you file it now, it'll count for Giving Day, but we really were looking for a very strong response from our alumni community. Now it's time for me to present our speaker for the day. I'm very happy to be able to introduce Emily Desjeux. She is a recent PhD graduate from the Dietrich College at Carnegie Mellon University. We're very proud of that. And just joined our faculty in 2022 as Assistant Teaching Professor of Business Communication. She received her BA in English and Secondary Education from Grove City College, and her MA and PhD, of course, from here in rhetoric. And she's been high school and different ages throughout. Now she's teaching college students, primarily this year with our undergraduate students, but she'll be teaching our master's students in the year ahead. You're going to hear about some of her work today as she talks about generative AI and its impact in business communications. But she's also does research in startups versus traditional small business and entrepreneurship. She'll be also working with our professors here on ethics and other things that are going on. So we're very happy to have her with us. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to my colleague, Emily Desjeux. Emily?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, John. I'll just go ahead and share my screen and get myself into presenter mode. Okay, I think you can see my screen now. So this is intentionally a blank screen. I just wanted to add to what John said. In addition to some of my past research, an area of real interest for me as of late is generative AI. I'm interested in this because I do a lot of writing instruction, and of course, generative AI can do a lot of impressive writing. So I've been spending about the last 10 to 11 months doing a lot of research and thinking about how to help students use this well to prepare them for the kind of workplace communication they're going to encounter in their jobs. Because this is a little bit of a longer talk, I just wanted to lay out my journey for you, the journey we're going to go on together. I'm going to open by talking about some context. I'm going to talk about what use of this tool looks like now in the professional landscape, and then how disruptive it could potentially be. I'm going to cite a couple new research studies. Then I'm going to get into some use cases. I'm going to talk first about using generative AI tools to plan messaging and communication, everything from researching to ideating, and then we'll get into drafting and revising. These tools are impressive because they can generate a lot of great bespoke text. We'll talk about how to use them to do that and also things to be wary of. And then I'm going to end with some thoughts on what it might mean to think about building a literacy framework. These tools are really new, they're changing. Is there any kind of framework building we can do now that would endure, even as these tools are changing and continuing to disrupt? So opening with some context, I want to talk a little bit about current use and potential disruption based on a couple new research studies that I found really helpful. The first study came out maybe a couple months ago, and it looked at, are business professionals using generative AI at work? The answer was yes, they are. These numbers were collected in early to mid 2023, so my sense is they're probably higher now. But even at that early point, when ChatGPT 3.5 was still relatively new, over half of executives reported they were using AI on a weekly basis, largely for communication-related tasks at that time. So use is one thing, but what about effective use? Is that use helpful? How disruptive could these tools be when we think about typical workplace communication? Another study that came out in early September kind of gives us a sense of what sort of disruption we could expect. This study worked with BCG consultants, and they had human plus ChatGPT teams and then human alone teams. One of the projects they set them to was develop a new product, and they had a number of tasks associated with that. This was everything from generating ideas to planning development to researching markets and competitors to communicating about this new product internally and externally. And then human raters evaluated the quality of each team's response. These raters were consultants and also MBA students, I believe at Wharton and Harvard. The results were pretty across the board consistent. The human and generative AI teams beat out the human alone teams in terms on several important measures. One of the things that generative AI helped these humans do was complete more tasks. They got 12% more task completion, and they completed those tasks on average 25% faster. So it had an efficiency boost, but there was also a quality boost. Human plus generative AI teams overall had 40% higher quality responses. What BCG noted as their top half consultants, they had a little bit of a quality boost, 17%, but it was really in the bottom half consultants that BCG said are new, still learning, not quite our top performers. Those bottom half consultants had a boost of 43% quality. So the research team noticed there was a real quality elevator for lower performing consultants compared to higher performing consultants. So this seems like exciting news, right? Generative AI can do a lot. It's really good at performing some types of complex high knowledge tasks, but not all. The second project that they set these human and generative AI and then human alone teams to was solving a business problem. So they gave each team a set of qualitative interview data and then a set of spreadsheet data. And they said, synthesize all this data to draw accurate conclusions and then write up some recommendations for a company CEO based on your conclusions. The results here were split. The human plus AI teams, they had higher quality ratings in terms of their written recommendations. The problem was those recommendations were more likely to be based on inaccurate conclusions. The human alone teams actually outperformed the human plus generative AI teams when it came to drawing correct conclusions. Because for whatever reason, ChatGPT had a really hard time synthesizing multiple different kinds of sometimes conflicting data and coming to conclusions that humans would say are true. The research team also sent up a couple other red flags. So in addition to this accuracy problem, they noted that in watching professionals use these tools, professionals who had negative performance when they used AI, that tended to happen because they were blindly adopting the AI's output and not really interrogating that output well. So they sent up a signal that said blind use is something to be wary of. They also noted in both tasks, including the ones where the generative AI was such a quality and productivity boost, they noticed that teams that used generative AI gradually had diminished diversity of ideas. In other words, the team's ideas became more and more homogeneous, and their written output became more and more homogeneous. They saw a greater diversity of ideas and a greater range of textual output from the human alone teams. So some challenges, some potential problems with these tools. Some conclusions they drew, and this is going to kind of set the stage for what I offer next. It is simply not yet clear what kinds of tasks we can reliably complete with generative AI assistance. And the researchers called this the jagged frontier of generative AI, hence the jagged line there. So generating ideas in text, this seems, based on this study, like something a generative AI tool can pretty reliably help humans do. But synthesizing complex data to draw accurate conclusions, generating diverse ideas in text, seems more up in the air, again, based on this study. This research team also noted that it's really not clear yet how humans should interact with generative AI to work really effectively. After observing all of their participants and studying their chat logs, they sort of noticed two trends. And these, fortunately, they created nice metaphors to describe these, and that's going to serve us well. They noted that some of these BCG professionals were like centaurs. It was half human, half generative AI. So the human kind of evenly divided their work, or pretty clearly divided their work, between themselves and the AI tool. But they noticed that other professionals who were also working really effectively with these tools tended to be more like cyborgs. Their efforts and the efforts of the generative AI tool they were using were so deeply intertwined and back and forth, it was difficult in the end to tell what of this work is the human and what of this work is the AI tool. And we're going to return to these metaphors a little bit later in this talk. So that's kind of some context. This is the lay of the land. It's early. Generative AI seems extremely promising and has real potential for disruption, but particulars about best use cases and best approaches to use still up in the air. So what I'm offering you are some provisional thoughts based on my own research and my own classroom practice. So I want to start thinking about use cases by thinking about planning a message. When you sit down and you are preparing a document, you're preparing a presentation, you're getting ready for a high stakes conversation, a fair bit of planning goes into getting ready for communications like that. One element of planning, of course, is research. And I'll tell you what, a week ago, if you had said, Emily, are LLMs good at research? I would have said no, they are not good research tools. Avoid using them that way. And I think I'm giving you two screenshots here of news articles that kind of confirm that. You might have heard of the case, the famous ChatGPT lawyer who turned to ChatGPT to conduct his legal research. He asked for cases that would help him make a point. ChatGPT obliged. He cited those cases in an amicus brief. Not one of them was real. So that was a real problem for him when that fallacy came to light. In addition, ChatGPT was making up so many articles and attributing them to The Guardian that The Guardian finally published their own article saying, do not assume that it tells you stuff that comes from us actually comes from us, verify first. So when these first came out up to quite recently, they were very poor research tools. But there are new capabilities. I'm thinking particularly of ChatGPT Plus, which is the tool I've gotten the most use out of. That tool in particular has some new, as of from what I can tell 3 or 4 days ago, some web browsing capabilities that actually make it pretty robust as a research assistant. So this is a model I'm showing here. This is me asking it to help me find sources to write a report about emerging trends in analytics. It scraped together a lot of really helpful popular media sources, and it hyperlinked me to them. When I pushed it and said, well, wait, I also need peer-reviewed academic sources, it found those. It pulled together some really great articles from a couple of top-notch journals and hyperlinked me to the publicly available abstracts. So I think tools that have web browsing capabilities, GPT Plus, Bard, these could have great potential to help streamline early research and provide kind of an easy way to get started with that process. Research aside, LLMs have been and currently are really, really great ideation tools. That is great for generating ideas when you are in the no bad ideas, let's throw everything at the wall and see what sticks phase of planning. And in fact, this is ChatGPT, OpenAI's CEO, Sam Altman. He has cited this as his preferred use case for these kinds of tools. I'm quoting here from an Atlantic article. The writer of this article interviewed Altman extensively. He says, GPT-4 is sometimes understood as a search engine replacement like Google, but easier to talk to. This is a misunderstanding. Altman has said it's best to think of GPT-4 as a reasoning engine. Its powers are most manifest when you ask it to compare concepts, make counterarguments, generate analogies, or evaluate the symbolic logic in a bit of code. And so I think this speaks to these tools' power to turbocharge existing human ingenuity and creativity and to take it to new heights. So in addition to research and ideation, these are two things I do often when I am planning an important message or composing a communication. But you might also, if you're like me, you might also consider data analysis, data visualization, an important part of planning a communication. I certainly do. When I'm going to write an article, often I will get all my data visualizations made and I will sort of stack them up. And that alone helps me see where my communication is headed. In the past, I've used a variety of spreadsheet programs to do this kind of analysis and visualization. Excel is the standby. I've also used Tableau. Some of you, and I've tried this too, I've played around with using Python programming environments or RStudio to do some of this analysis and data visualization. There's a fair bit of a learning curve to some of those tools. What's really exciting is that LLMs like ChatGPT Plus, again, this is the tool I'm most familiar with, some of them have very, very impressive data analysis and visualization capabilities. So I'll show you, I'm working right now on an article, it was just accepted, exploring GPT Plus's capabilities to analyze and visualize data. To do that, I fed GPT Plus an enormous spreadsheet that contains data on every Olympic athlete who has competed in an Olympic event from 1896 to 2016, so a huge spreadsheet. And I was able, in about 3 minutes, to generate these two stacked bar charts. This shows overall medal counts for the top 10 countries with the highest overall totals, the distribution of medals, and then it separates them into a male bar plot and a female bar plot. And again, I was able to produce this in a couple minutes using the least sophisticated prompting. I mean, prompting like, make the bars fatter, make the gold chunk be on top and the bronze chunk be on the bottom. Really, really unsophisticated, sort of blunt prompting. This isn't a particularly sophisticated or interesting kind of data visualization, but I think it speaks to the power of a tool like this to produce this kind of analysis and visualization very quickly and effectively. So ChatGPT Plus, other tools like it, really useful potentially for planning. For data analysis, visualization, research, ideation, but there are, of course, things to be careful about. Using LLMs for informational purposes, it requires careful scrutiny because the outputs of these tools can be inaccurate, biased, or incomplete. I think inaccuracy is something that we're probably all pretty familiar with. These tools' tendency to hallucinate. This was sort of an early newsmaker. So I'm showing a screenshot here. This is a classic example. This is the public figure asking ChatGPT about himself. Most of what it returns, as you can see, is false, including the fact that, according to ChatGPT, the man who made this query was deceased. And this problem is going to stick with us. This is a quote by Vu Han. This is a researcher and engineer at the Allen Institute. And this researcher points out that LLMs do and always will hallucinate. We can improve rates of hallucination, but we probably can't eliminate that. The real question then is if the benefits of using a tool like this outweigh the negative outcomes caused by hallucination. So if you're in an ideating, no bad ideas stage, hallucination might not be a problem. In fact, hallucination could be quite interesting. It could ramp up your creativity greatly. But if you're talking about collecting research that you need to verify is true or analyzing and reporting on data trends, then of course, hallucination is a real liability and something to watch for. Sometimes the mistakes that tools like ChatGPT Plus will make are really easy to spot and thus easy to fix. So again, this is an example from the article I told you I'm working on. I asked ChatGPT, I said, give me a bar plot that shows me the most popular Olympic sports for female athletes based on the participation of unique female athletes in events in that sport. As the bar plot shows, swimming is the clear most popular by that metric. ChatGPT displayed that, but then in the little textual blurb underneath, it said to me, as you can see, gymnastics is the most popular sport, followed by swimming and rowing. Obviously incorrect, easy to spot and easy to quickly figure out which is right, the bar plot or the text. More insidious, though, are mistakes that are harder to spot because they're subtler and they require expert knowledge and judgment. This is an example of that kind of mistake. ChatGPT and I were going back and forth trying to find interesting relationships to explore in this data set. One of the relationships that floated to the surface was the relationship between an Olympic athlete's age and their chances of winning any medal. I asked ChatGPT to explore this relationship. It performed a t-test and it said, Eureka, there's a significant relationship between age and medal winning. Medal winners are a little bit older by like a couple of months. So statistically significant, not practically significant. My thumbs down emoji is probably signaling if you don't already know this. It did a t-test. This is the wrong test of significance to use on this data. As this histogram shows, the age of Olympic athletes is not normally distributed data, and t-tests require data to be normally distributed. So this is a faulty test. I pointed this out to ChatGPT. It said, oh, my bad, you're absolutely right. It performed a Mann-Whitney U-test, the right test to use if data is not normal. Both of these tests return significant p-values, but obviously the risk inherent in having a tool perform the wrong kind of statistical analysis and possibly produce biased or faulty results is a real problem. And I think points to the fact that even though we can outsource some of this work to a tool, the human user always has to have enough expertise to critically evaluate its output and catch even subtle errors like this one. So in addition to inaccuracies, we also have to be real mindful of these tools' capacity to circulate bias. This isn't a new problem. Bias in machine learning and algorithms is as old as machine learning and algorithms. But the ubiquity and kind of the diffuseness of these generative AI tools represent a new level of threat to circulate biased information on a scale never seen before. Research has confirmed that these tools, they just tend to reproduce existing racial and gender stereotypes. They also tend to reproduce political biases. This is a really sticky problem, and there's not a clear solution to this that I've seen. I think that's down to the fact that the data that we feed into these tools to learn on text in particular, it often reflects societal biases, right? That's data created by people. People are subject to human biases. People reproduce biases. My guess is it is also reinforced or introduced when these tools interact with human trainers. No pool of human trainers could possibly represent all of humanity. So there are going to be ideologies or perspectives that get signaled more greatly in that training process. And so something to be mindful of when we're asking these tools for information. In addition to inaccuracies and biases, though, I also think we should keep in mind that sometimes the information these tools will give us, it's not that it's wrong or that it's bad, it's just that it's not done. It's not as robust and deep and comprehensive as it needs to be. Back to this bar plot as an example. This shows, again, top 10 countries with the highest overall medal counts and distributions for male athletes. One of the problems I ran into when I asked ChatGPT to do this is that ChatGPT cannot by itself account for European political history since 1896. And so I realized, I need to ask it to combine medal totals for East Germany, West Germany, and Germany to get an accurate look at Germany's medal counts. That seemed pretty straightforward. Much stickier was the question of, should I combine medal counts for Russia and the Soviet Union? I think I told you it took me about 3 minutes to produce these bar plots. It took me easily 4 or 5 times longer to answer this question about combining medals for Russia and the Soviet Union. I had to do a lot of research. I talked to 2 people. Ultimately, I did combine them for this article because that aligns with how the UN understands the relationship between Russia and the former Soviet Union. It's also pretty standard in media reporting that looks at historic medal counts. But obviously, that's a sticky question, given the fact that it's 2023 and there's a war in Europe. And so I think it raises the point that, again, human judgment and critical thinking rooted in human experience is always going to be necessary to evaluate the output of these tools, because even when they're correct, they might not be complete. And as a last step in thinking about planning, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about these tools and really impressive summarization capabilities. So this is a particularly exciting application. If you, as you're listening to me talk, if you have a job where reading and understanding, digesting a lot of text is a big part of your job, these tools could have great promise for you. I'm screenshotting here I think this is Policy Insider AI and Blue AI, kind of a combo. This is a product they've created that's meant to help policy researchers and analysts get through a lot of new research quickly to inform policymaking. So what you can see here, we have a full text to the left and then a nice tight little AI generated summary to the right. Potentially really useful if, again, you have to get through a lot of text quickly on a regular basis as part of your job. But of course, any efficiencies in using these tools for summarization has to be balanced against your needs and the stakes involved in what you're going to do with that information. So I think asking yourself questions like, what's the context and exigence for me reading this? What are my goals for this information? What do I want to do with it? And what are the potential outcomes of acting on my summary of this information? I think in a case where all you need is a high-level summary of the themes in a text, an AI-generated summary is probably going to get you really far. If you need more than that, or if the stakes are much higher than simply broad bird's eye view knowledge, I think that's when it becomes tricky to think about how much of your reading do you outsource to a tool and how much are you then obligated to do yourself, because you bring goals and exigencies and potential outcomes that are fungible and changeable and perhaps very high stakes. So that's a little bit about planning. How can we use this as we get ready to craft a message, we prepare to talk or have a meeting or write something of consequence? But of course, we have to talk about drafting and revising, because the amazing capacity of these tools is their ability to generate really high quality bespoke text that sounds like it is human authored. That's really exciting. How can you use that at work, right? What are some ways to use that? I should say right out of the gate, and apologies if this is a disappointment, I have studied this, I've practiced a bunch with different tools. My conclusion is that there is no secret sauce to using these tools to produce the kind of output that you would produce yourself on your best day. There's no magic set of prompts. There's no online guru who can really help you do that. I'll go back to that BCG study I mentioned at the beginning. They had human and generative AI teams. One set of teams received training, best practices for using this tool. Here's some prompts to try. The other team didn't get any training. They were just told, figure it out. And one of the outcomes of that article that I think is interesting, there was not a really appreciable difference between the team that got trained to use AI and the team that didn't. Both sets of teams were faster, they had higher quality outputs. I think that points to the fact that training doesn't really get you ahead here. So assuming you're going to take an ad hoc approach where you try it out and then you sort of iterate on your different approaches to see what works, let me give you a sense of what those approaches might look like. Approaches to drafting and revising anything with a generative AI tool should be driven by both your goals for writing, what do you want to get out of this and what do you want your text or your message to do, and your comfort level with AI assistance. So going back to those metaphors from earlier, you might find as you try out these tools and iterate through that you're taking more of a centaur approach that would produce fewer, longer, and more detailed prompts. And it would end up producing a clear delineation of your work and the tool's work. This is a screenshot from that research study of what centaur-like work looks like. So the prompt in green there, that is a BCG consultant giving very clear directions to the AI tool. In black is the AI tool's output. The consultant then takes that output, turns away, and works on it on their own. So fewer, longer, more detailed prompts. I don't have any sense yet. This research team is still investigating these approaches. My sense is that this approach might feel most comfortable for folks who are not all that comfortable with these tools yet. My hunch is also, though, that this approach might feel most natural when the task you're doing is something you already feel like you're pretty good at and you feel like you're pretty expert in. And so you don't need a lot of ongoing help from a generative AI tool. You might also find, though, that as you iterate through and sort of try out and see what feels right, you might find that you're taking more of a cyborg approach. And that would involve many shorter, more focused prompts, a lot more interaction back and forth with the tool, and an output where the delineation of you and the tool is pretty blurry. Again, here's a screenshot from that research study. The green there, the two little prompts, that's the BCG consultants. That longer in black, that is the AI tool. And what you see is this consultant essentially asks AI to do all the text generating, and then they iterate through. They point out problems. They say, why didn't you include this? Try this, take out this. So they're doing a lot of focused kind of interrogating, refining, adding, subtracting via their prompting of something the tool has initially created. Again, I think my sense there is that approach is great if you feel really comfortable with these kinds of tools. Or again, all my hunch, I think if the task at hand is something you don't feel that comfortable with, or your literacy isn't real high, you might want the tool to do a lot of that lift for you. That cyborg approach could perhaps be helpful. So in both of these approaches, what you're doing is you are outsourcing things to the tool that, this time last year, you would have done yourself. A couple notes of caution: anytime you're going to outsource work to a tool like ChatGPT or Bard or Claude. First, keep in mind that writing and thinking are fundamentally connected. I have a couple of quotes up here by writers whose names you might recognize, including Stephen King, who's one of my favorites. They're all pointing to the reality that is true. Writing and thinking are really closely combined. So often my students will think, Eureka, this is great. I'm just going to outsource all my writing to this tool. My thinking is fine and unimpaired. The tool's just going to do the writing labor for me. And I have to break the bad news and say, not so. Writing and the process of planning and composing and then refining a message, we're also refining and strengthening our own thinking. So anytime you outsource, you want to be thinking about, is this impacting at all my understanding, my thinking on this topic? In addition, writing is a really social activity, which is odd to say. I think a lot of us, writing is pretty solitary. We sit at our desk and we write quietly by ourselves. But writing always involves consideration of one's audience. And so in that sense, it is social. When we write, we're always thinking about, what is this person reading this, or what is this person listening or watching? What do they need? What do they want? What arguments are going to be really compelling for them? And so when you outsource, you have to make really sure you're keeping audience front of mind and you're not sort of losing that social audience focused aspect of your composition. Because of these two things, in light of these two things, I think avoiding blindly outsourcing any kind of writing to an LLM is a good idea, because the results can be quite bad. And I have an example of that here. This is a message I wrote really quickly for my students. We were talking about a particular kind of argument strategy. I wrote this email in about, 20 seconds. It's okay. It's not great. Everything in red there is a violation of best practices of concision, and my students were learning that at that time. So I wrote this, and then I said, well, let's outsource the revision to ChatGPT. This is 143 words long. It's not perfect. Let's ask ChatGPT to fix it. So we did the most minimal prompting possible. We just said to the tool, do you have suggestions for making this better? It had a lot. And then we said, okay, fair enough. Please write a new version of this email that leverages all those suggestions, right? Blind outsourcing of the revision. The output was a lot worse. Again, everything in red there is a clear violation of a best practice of concision. So lots of unnecessary phrases and clauses. 2 sentences are fully in passive voice. That wasn't true in the first message. And it got longer. So not only was it violating all kinds of writing best practices, it was even longer than the first one. So my students universally said the first one is better. And this was kind of a great example for them of why we don't want to outsource any part of our practice to this tool without thinking about the output itself. So if you're hearing this and you're thinking, well, yeah, outsourcing might be helpful, but obviously there's some things to be careful about, How else could I maybe use this tool to improve my communication? If I don't want to outsource, or I want to outsource selectively, what else could this help me do? Well, my research suggests that one way to get help from a tool like this without outsourcing is to ask it to help create sample or model documents. Research for decades tells us that when professionals are faced with some kind of new communication task that they don't feel very comfortable with or familiar with, they go in search of samples. If samples are hard to find or you don't have many, you can ask an LLM to create samples. Samples are really useful for answering structure questions. What is this supposed to look like? They're also useful for answering style questions. What should this sound like? The inverse is also true. If you have a lot of samples, then you don't necessarily want to read all of them at first. You can ask ChatGPT to give you a bird's eye view. You can say something like, based on these samples, and upload a big file of them, create a best practices guide for writing this kind of document, or create a template for writing in this genre, or identify interesting differences across these samples. That might point to variation, like places where you had room to exercise some creative control. So you're probably seeing how this could not only be useful to you, if you train people on a team maybe, this could be quite useful for offering guidance to junior employees. You can also ask ChatGPT to function not as an assistant writer, a co-author, but as a consultant, as a tutor maybe. This is how I use it. When I don't outsource any of my own writing to ChatGPT because I write for a living in part, so I don't want to outsource that skill to these tools, but I really like using them as consultants. So sometimes I'll upload portions of a draft that I'm struggling with. Sometimes I ask broad questions like, any ideas for making this better? Sometimes I ask very specific questions. I think this paragraph is not clear. Can you offer me some insights into why it might not be clear and how I can fix it? What you're getting then are not edits, you're getting high-level suggestions. Not everything these tools return is helpful, but in my experience, sometimes what they surface as a potential improvement is really helpful and something I would not have considered. So it almost functions as like a first set of eyes to sort of critique and consult. So that's a little bit about use cases for planning, drafting, revising. Obviously, a lot to think about. One challenge, though, is that these tools are changing at such a rapid rate. I think I told you a week ago, I would have said ChatGPT Plus is not a good research tool. New functionalities, from what I can tell, added in the last few days mean it could be a great research tool. So how do we keep up with the fact that anything we feel certain about now in terms of use might change in a week, in a month, will certainly look different in a year? What could we be doing now to prepare ourselves to use these tools well? I'm going to end with a couple minutes just thinking about building an AI literacy framework when it comes to workplace communication. And I'm drawing this from a research study that came out a couple of months ago. And they develop really 4 things to consider when you are thinking about for yourself or maybe helping your team build a framework for good, effective, ethical use at work. Part of that framework is obviously, it involves application, and that's most of what we've talked about today. When to use it, how to use it, when not to use it, what applications seem more promising than others. But the research team that wrote this article and developed this framework also points to accountability as a concern. Their question, and the question they want us to be asking ourselves, is who's responsible for ensuring that a communication is accurate and that it's serving its intended audience well? Existing human frameworks for accountability center accountability on humans. So even when a tool might make a mistake, case in point, the ChatGPT lawyer, when the tool makes a mistake, it's still the human who's liable and the human who's responsible. So how are we allowing that to inform the ways that we use these tools and the way we train our people to use these tools? In addition, this research team points us to how important it is to think about agency. Is the use of an AI tool enhancing, complementing a human communicator's knowledge, skills, and decision-making, or is it limiting those things? The earlier research study that used BCG consultants that I mentioned, this is a real concern they surface at the very end of that article. They note that because generative AI tools do a lot of high knowledge, complex tasks well, they are very concerned that companies are going to stop training junior employees on how to do those tasks. And they're especially concerned that that will trickle down into formal training, right, in higher education, internships perhaps. And they foreground that as a problem. They think investing in human capital and skill building is still quite relevant, and that we should resist the false takeaway that these tools mean there's a whole set of human skills we don't have to build up in younger people and keep honing for ourselves. And then finally, and I think most interestingly, this research team points to the need to think about authenticity. So of course, there are messages where it does not matter at all if it sounds like a human wrote it. When I get automated customer service messages from groups that I patronize, services that I use, I don't care that it doesn't sound genuine or human. But other communications, it really does matter if there's an authentic human voice behind that. And so questions like, does this message reflect human voice, personality, and style? Is it genuine and sincere? Is it enhancing relationships and building trust? There was the case of the email that Vanderbilt University sent out at the beginning of this year in the wake of a university shooting. It was an email meant to comfort students and point to the value of safety and sort of togetherness in a tough time. The message, again, I think from the office of the president, had been composed entirely by ChatGPT, and the message disclosed that. The backlash to that was swift and fierce, because indeed, we expect messages like that to come from people because we want them to reflect human emotion. And so authenticity, also a key element to think about as we're thinking about building out a broader framework for AI literacy and workplace communication. That's all I've got. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we'll turn it over for Q&A.
Well, thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. We appreciate it very much. We already have some questions from our alumni audience. I'm going to start with our first one. If Gen AI can make up Guardian articles and legal cases, how can you best verify that your hyperlinks for other sources also aren't fabricated? And do we need publishers to have verification keys we can lock into?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So this is one of the things that my research has indicated to me is that the old school skills we associate with information literacy, like being able to evaluate the quality of a source, are still going to be extremely important, even in this age of generative AI. So for example, all the hyperlinks that I showed in that screenshot, I went out to verify, I think 3. And of course, when you land on the journal's page and you have that nice, it's the lock icon that tells you this is really the page, and then you're seeing the author credits and you're verifying where they come from, you can feel pretty good about that. Likewise, if it's sending you to Forbes, right, Forbes.com, and you can verify this is an actual Forbes article, you're good to go. But I do think this points to the need to really interrogate everything this tool gives you, and to not assume, even if it looks right, it has all the trappings of something that is true, not to assume that it's true until you, the human, have used your information literacy toolkit to ensure the veracity of that information and the credibility of that source.
Related to that, I think there is some question about if you have it do some research for you and you include that in and it doesn't cite the sources, and you have a paper that you've prepared maybe for a presentation, and you find out that you're actually plagiarizing someone and not citing their sources. How do we know that? How do you verify that?
Sure, yeah. And again, I think this is where even though these tools are so new and they're so cutting edge and they seem so incredibly disruptive, there's so much that we already know how to do and frameworks we already have that we can draw on. So again, to my knowledge, and I use ChatGPT Plus a couple times a week, I stumbled upon this web browsing capability and this hyperlinking ability, 3 days ago. I thought, oh my gosh, this is new. This was not here a week ago. And so what I plan to do next semester is to tell my students, we're doing right now a consulting project where they pick a client, they work with that client, and there's a little bit of research involved in that. I'm going to direct them to this tool and say, hey, this could be a great complement to the kind of more careful, curated work you're doing in our library databases to round up sources. When it comes to drawing on these sources, just like you would cite, really carefully paraphrase with accurate citations any other source that you didn't draw from an LLM or an LLM didn't kind of put on your plate, you're going to do that same thing with any source that a ChatGPT or a Bard serves up to you, right? Same rules of paraphrase, citation still apply.
And so maybe you could share with our audience what you're already doing in the classroom and some of the instructions that you've been given from CMU and the Eberly Center on this
sure.
various area.
Yeah. So it's an exciting time. I don't know if anyone on the webinar is in higher ed. It's an exciting moment in higher ed. I'm choosing to see it as an exciting opportunity. I know people who are really seeing it as a moment of dread. What I do feel like it's incumbent on all of us to really help students learn how to use these tools well in order to prepare them for really effective and ethical workplace practice. For me, that means I am inviting my students to use these tools on different communication assignments. Right now, I am suggesting specific use cases, and I'm asking them to document if they choose to use a tool in that way. That's getting harder and harder to do because none of the watermarking or tools that are supposed to detect, is it AI generated or human generated, totally unreliable, not usable. So I think next semester, my approach is going to be to say to students, no holds barred, you can use this for anything. And then I'm changing the assignment. So for example, one of my assignments, I used to have students write a negative message. It was a great chance to think about how do you convey bad news in a way that is clear and ethical, but also softens the blow and maintains goodwill. That assignment is now, it's not going to be about producing a negative message. It's going to be a portfolio assignment where they use a tool like ChatGPT or Bard to walk through, get to the message that you want, that you like, and then document for me and reflect on the process by which you got there. Was it worth your time and effort? What did you learn about using these tools to generate messages like this? I think some changes to assignments are going to really open up what we can do with these tools in the classroom. And it remains to be seen, will this change writing instruction at the university level? Possibly. I think it's early to say that, and we still want to invest in student skill building. I have a number of students who say, I know this is great, but I don't want to use it because I want to build these skills myself, which I really respect. So we're at a little bit of an inflection point that's interesting. But yeah, that's a little, I guess, a summary of what I'm doing now and what I hope to do next semester.
Very good. I know there was an earlier question about how do you anticipate industry will respond to the new AI regulations that are being proposed by the president's executive order and legislation in the Senate? I know this is not your specialty, but what are you talking about with your colleagues and the staff and here at the university?
Sure, yeah. So I can definitely speak to the president's executive order that came out a week or two ago. We actually have I have a colleague here in organizational behavior. He is our expert at Tepper now in AI ethics. He's actually written a book about this. He has a new book contract that was just finalized pretty recently. His name's Derek Leben, Leben. Derek, as soon as that executive order was out, he wrote up some commentary on it, and it's published through Tepper's communications group. So there's a lot of good guidance. I think he's the expert there, so I'll defer to his commentary. In terms of responding to regulation, as I share, here are use cases, here are ways to try it. I do that with full knowledge that there is no consensus right now in industry about how this can be used or even if it's allowed to be used. So I know we're seeing companies that have banned the use of this because there are very, very real and very pressing concerns about security. There was the case of Samsung where some proprietary kind of closed information was loaded into ChatGPT. And now, of course, that information is no longer private, right? It's part of ChatGPT's training data and it can't be extracted. So I think, concerns about privacy and security are real and should be addressed. We're also finding, though, that banning it is not working. I think I can't remember the exact percentage. It's a surprisingly high percentage of employees who report, I'm not supposed to use this at work. I am using it at work on my phone. So banning it does not seem like it's going to work very long term. But I think it remains to be seen. How will companies really leverage the incredible benefits of this while also ensuring company data, client data is protected and secured? And of course, none of that speaks to regulatory concerns about were these tools built using plagiarized information? And what does that mean for how any of us can use them? That, of course, way above my pay grade and remains to be seen.
Yeah, I know there were concerns at the very beginning when OpenAI announced that ChatGPT was going to be available. A lot of the scholars in the field and practitioners, the computer scientists said, wait, we haven't had a chance. This has a lot of capabilities that could be used for ill as well as for good, but it's out there now. And I think the security concerns, maybe talk a little bit more about the security concerns that you would see from a from a corporate side of things and corporate communication and corporate
Yeah.
use of this information?
Of course, yeah. So again, not necessarily my area, but I can speak broadly based on the research I've done. I'm a fellow at the Center for Intelligent Business, so I've been thinking about this, reading all I can. I think the major concern, of course, is the data, security, and privacy. So ChatGPT Plus, Bard, these other tools, they are most useful when you keep a record of your chat history. But of course, then everything you are offering to the tool, it absorbs back into its training data, and it's not yours anymore. So you really have to think carefully, what am I putting in here and how could that be used later? There are instructors at some schools sort of saying, oh, I'm going to feed my students work in this. It's going to help me offer feedback faster. As far as I know, that's a big no-no. You can't feed student work into a tool like this because that's FERPA protected. So even for those of us in higher ed, there are real concerns about what can we feed in here and what can we not. I also do think, though, there are some real ethical concerns about the data that these tools were initially trained on. So you probably saw there's a growing number of authors who've joined a class action lawsuit against OpenAI saying, you used pirated copies of our work to train this. You can't do that, right? That's a violation of our copyright. Remains to be seen if that's true. Real concerns from artists and people in creative communities. You're training these tools on our artwork, and it feels like it's diminishing the value of human creativity and genius. That's a real ethical problem. The problem of bias. This is something Derek points to in that commentary I mentioned, if you're interested in looking that up. He points to the data that some of these have trained on. They are so flawed and non-representative and biased. It's illegal to use. I mean, the formation of these tools using that data raises real legal questions. So I think in addition to privacy and security concerns, there are like ethical, sticky problems that companies are going to have to sort out. Do we want to be associated with some of these risks? Do we want to incur the risks inherent in using these tools in order to really benefit from their potential gains in productivity and quality?
Very good. Yes, and don't put your budget in there and your family details, okay? Couple questions relating to the AI tools. One was, have you seen any examples of an AI tool adapting the voice of the communicator or specialized phrasing for an industry versus more generic language?
Sure. So I play around with this a little bit. This is something that I think is improving. They're always improving. That's one of the hard things is these tools are not static. They are changing, like I'm sure by the minute. I think there have been some improvements in these tools' ability, for instance, to adopt an individual writer's style. So there's cases of people feeding their work in, describing their style, saying, learn my style from these, and then saying, okay, I want you to write this message in my style, right? And there's some evidence that it can kind of do that. It can also adopt other styles. So my students that I've noticed, if you tell it, write this in a professional, formal style, what it does, it produces text that sounds increasingly stiff and stuffy, and it gets longer and longer. So it's kind of adopting a style there. It remains an open question. Is that style effective? I would say no. But I do expect, I know that they are working on helping these tools develop the capacity to have a kind of emotional resonance, to sort of reflect the emotion inherent in maybe a human voice writing. So I think we can expect to see some of these style things improve. What I caution my students toward is, you can do all the prompting you want, that cyborg style where you keep iterating on the same draft to make changes until you get something you love. That's a great approach, and you can keep iterating on style. It's just good to remember the research tells us even an individual person like me, there is not an Emily style. I have styles when I talk to the dean here, and it's different than the style I use when I talk to my students and the style I use when I talk to my husband. So even I have a multifaceted, complex style. That's true, of course, of every human communicator on this call.
Has any work been done looking into Gen AI's use in assisting or coaching with public speaking or with oral communication in general?
Oh, yeah. If you Google that, there are a lot of companies that really want to sell you something that will do that. Yeah. So, and these tools have been around for a little while. The generative part of generative AI is new, and that has exciting applications. So there's an application right here, I think in Pittsburgh, out of CMU, called Talk Me Up. That uses AI to provide feedback on your presentation. I think Zoom now has this baked in. Zoom Companion, I think it's called. It has a lot of cool capacities. One of them, I think, is giving you feedback on your presentation in a recorded sort of Zoom format. There are a lot of tools out there that say they're going to help you create your presentation. I think, I'm skeptical of some of those. I think they're mostly just presentation slide templates with AI layered on to auto-generate speaker notes. How quality is a presentation that is mostly automated? My guess is not as high quality as one that the human really leaned into and thought about audience and thought about storytelling and, helpful messaging. But those tools exist. And again, my sense is they will probably only improve with time.
Okay, we're down to our last 5 minutes. I'm going to give you kind of rapid fire ones here.
Sure.
If researching debated topics or ideology, do the tools reflect the views of the creators of the tool? Are there ways to understand the viewpoints of the tool?
Sure, yeah. So I think I screenshotted a study out of MIT. Says you're going to get different political biases based on the tool you use, which was new to me. There's a study out of, I think, Brookings from the summer it sort of says, yes, what you sense is true. ChatGPT has a left-leaning / libertarian, I think, political viewpoint if you ask it enough questions. Yeah, society is diverse, right? This is the beautiful thing about living in a diverse plural democracy. A lot of views are allowed and encouraged to live. How do you capture that diversity and heterogeneity in a tool? I don't know. I don't know how that's possible, especially when the information you're feeding it contains biases. And then, of course, the humans who are reviewing it and training it themselves are just situated people with worldviews and perspectives. And that's not a bad thing. We all have that, right? We all have ideologies and worldviews that guide us as we move through life. But I think that all speaks to the point of the orientation that I encourage for my students and I've adopted for myself. I am leaning into trying out these tools to boost my own creativity and productivity. My orientation, though, is fundamentally critical. Everything ChatGPT Plus gives me, I think, really, let me think about that. Let me weigh that against the breadth of my experience as a person and my knowledge. And so I think that will always be important, in part to suss out exactly the kind of biases and bents that the questioner is talking about.
Another question was, AI writing and painting for us will lead to even greater information overload. How do we balance the information load as producers and recipients? Does AI also help us in balancing the load? We all know we're in overload at this stage.
Yeah, I know. So this is the joke. So Jacques Ellul, I studied him just a little bit. Yeah, he's a French philosopher. He's in part a philosopher of technology. He made the point, and I've never forgotten it because it so aligns with my own experience. Technology, we create it to solve a problem for us, and then it creates a new problem. So we need new technology to solve the new problem, which then, of course, and it becomes this sort of circular loop where technology is both solving and creating new complicated problems. Information overload is certainly one of them. So I expect, the proliferation of information available is probably only going to increase with tools like that. And that way it might mirror the proliferation of information like with the dawn of the internet. In terms of how we sort through that, I think that's a really good question. And my guess is makers of places like OpenAI are going to say, use our tools. ChatGPT creates information overload. You need ChatGPT to help you sort through all this information that you can't parse on your own, right?
Well, last question. You're a parent. Many of our audience are parents and trying to figure out, how do I advise my children using ChatGPT? Any advice for them before we close our webinar today?
I do. As a former middle school teacher, K-12, you are building critical skills that must not be shortcut, in my opinion. Late high school, I think, could be a good time to encourage 11th, 12th grader to start trying out this tool in limited ways. Once they're in college, that's when I think, man, you've built a lot of really important literacies. Now we can start building in generative AI literacy as a new kind of literacy. My kids' school has banned this from their Chromebooks. I was thrilled about that decision. I don't have to try and police their use because, again, I do think a lot of the skill building and knowledge-based formation they're doing in kindergarten, middle school, or elementary, middle school, and then even early high school is critical. And there is real potential for tools like this to shortcut some of that work, right, and streamline the dissonance that we associate with learning.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for all your insights today. We know this is a evolving field, And we'll maybe in a year we'll have you back to say what lessons have we really learned in the last year or so. But thank
Wonderful.
you to you, Professor Dijou. And for all of our alumni, thank you for joining us today. We hope that you'll join us again in January for our investment outlook, and then back to generative AI and how it's impacting finance and operations and marketing and all these other fields that you learned at when you were here at one of the leading business schools in the world. So thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again. And for all of you who celebrate Thanksgiving, have a happy Thanksgiving.